So the project aims to bring together data specifically for Roman period Britain and Germany and to ask three closely related questions. Why do Roman objects end up in riverine contexts, particularly at bridges and river crossings? Can close examination of the composition of these assemblages and their contexts provide some clues as to whether they represent ritual deposits or rubbish disposal? And can we move beyond merely labelling these assemblages as ritual and rubbish to explore the identities of those involved in depositing objects in rivers? So before trying to address this question, it's briefly worth reviewing how scholars have interpreted Roman riverine assemblages of objects in the past. Accidental loss is the most common interpretation for both individual objects and large assemblages. For example, solitary items of military equipment found on riverbeds across the continent are frequently argued to be the results of the unfortunate mishaps of soldiers on campaign. There's also frequently an attempt to weave stories around assemblages based on historical narratives, such as the 3rd century crisis. A very good example of this is the material from Neupots, which was found during dredging work in the Rhine in Germany last century. The hoard comprised more than 1,000 objects, including bronze and silver tableware, as well as tools, weapons, and religious objects. Despite the material having a very wide date range, it's been interpreted as booty, looted from a Gaulish villa estate, which a barbarian raiding party lost trying to cross the river in the turbulent years of the late 3rd century AD. And the museum where it's displayed in Berlin refers to it as the barbarian treasure. Now, shipwrecks are also suggested as a reason why objects turn up in riverine contexts. We know of riverine shipwrecks of both trading vessels and military patrol boats from sites throughout the Roman world. Take, for example, the 6 wooden ships from De Meern in the Netherlands, which were excavated in the 1990s and early 2000s. Within the cabin of the ship shown here, which is De Meern 1, archaeologists recovered a number of finds which were presumed to be the captain's personal belongings, including brooches, coins, and storage vessels, as well as carpentry and stoneworking tools. Of course, rubbish disposal is obviously another plausible interpretation of riverine object assemblages. And rivers and floodplains are clearly convenient places to dump rubbish, while middens were frequently dug into the soft soil of riverbanks. Perhaps the most famous rubbish dump in the Roman world is the Schutthügel outside the legionary fortress of Vindonissa in Switzerland. And this slumped down a slope and into the river there, outside one of the legionary fortress's gates. Even today, the Schutthügel is 200 meters long, 80 meters wide, and 18 meters high. And excavations of the mound have recovered more than 200,000 objects, including military equipment, brooches, and leather shoes. Now, rivers frequently change their courses and erode settlement sites. It can be very difficult to establish sometimes whether objects were originally deposited in water or simply ended up there as a result of riverine erosion. For example, at Augsburg Oberhausen in Germany, recent flooding and changes in river course have cut through a Roman military installation, revealing numerous occupation deposits and even a massive coin hoard. Meanwhile, in Roman London, it can be very difficult to distinguish between the ancient riverbed and nearby urban stratigraphy. Then there's the idea of deliberate deposition, that rivers acted as space where communication with the gods was possible and where offerings could be made to ensure their divine favour. While this is an idea which is almost universally accepted in prehistory, and explored extensively by scholars like Richard Bradley in his work, The Passage to Arms, it doesn't have the same sort of acceptance for the Roman period. Of course, some Roman assemblages found in water are interpreted through a votive lens. Good examples of this are provided by the Sacred Spring at Bath and well deposits like that from Draper's Gardens in London. However, here the places where objects are deposited are created or controlled by human agency rather than being natural spaces. Finally, of course, objects found in Roman rivers could be a mixture of all these depositional processes, with rubbish mixed in with votive deposits, accidental losses, and riverine erosion. A key aim of our project is establishing whether it's possible to identify these different depositional processes in the archaeological record. And what has been clear from the outset of the project is that Roman archaeologists have made and repeated assumptions about depositional processes for riverine assemblages. These assumptions are underpinned by a focus on the functional, the rational, and on using archaeology as the handmaiden of historical narratives. As a result, most object assemblages from riverine sites are only partially recorded, with special or valuable objects cherry-picked for cataloguing and subsequent publication. Particular object types are recorded, while others remain ignored. A great example of this is a riverine site in Verulamium, which was excavated by Freer in 1956. In his report on the site, he notes that great quantities of pottery and other objects were recovered from alluvial deposits in the river there, but he only actually publishes the coins. Scholars also narrowly define what might represent ritual behavior in a Roman context. For example, the presence of functional objects like tools and vessels is often used to argue against a ritual interpretation for assemblages. And some of these judgments are clearly underpinned by the particular way in which academic study has approached the study of Roman bridges, where many of these assemblages are found. There's a clear focus on their architectural sophistication and permanence, something which these reconstruction images of Roman bridges in northern Britain conveys. It's really clear that crossing a river, though, was a deeply symbolic act in the Roman period, and sometimes dangerous too. Think Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. And sacrifices were required to keep river gods like the mighty river Danube on side. Seen here, surveying Roman soldiers crossing a pontoon bridge in a detail from Trajan's column. Altars were frequently set up next to or even on bridges and were dedicated to specific deities such as sea and river gods. Altars to Neptune and Oceanus found in the River Tyne at Newcastle are likely to have come from the bridge named Pons Aelius, after which the settlement there was named. Carvings of apotropaic phalluses have been found decorating bridges throughout the Roman world, including at Chesters in Northumberland and the Pont du Gard in southern France. This clearly shows that bridges were considered to be liminal spaces where interaction with the gods was necessary. So when we're thinking about Roman objects found at bridges or river crossings, we have to remember the possible religious motivations for deposition, as well as the rational, functional ones. So having briefly outlined previous scholarly approaches and interpretations, what methodologies can we use to establish rubbish from ritual from accidental loss? The best way forward is likely to involve study of all the objects found at a particular riverine site, rather than just cherry-picking selected highlights. And then we need to think thoroughly about the context in which they're found. Of course, that's not always possible, given the fact that riverine deposits are rarely systematically excavated by archaeologists. However, there are a few places in the Roman world where we can attempt this. The first example we're going to look at is Piercebridge in County Durham, where in the mid-1980s, two divers, Bob Middlemus and Rolf Mitchinson, began diving in the River Tees. They quickly began to discover thousands of objects on the riverbed, and from 1986 until Rolf's death in 2019, collecting these objects became the main focus of their attention. Their assemblage formed the focus of a previous research project, which I undertook with Professor Hella Eckardt at the University of Reading. What I'm now going to do is summarise some of the key points made in our open access monograph, Bridge Over Troubled Water. So do seek that out on the ADS if you want to learn more. The village of Piercebridge sits at a strategic point where the Roman road from the legionary fortress at York to the northern frontier crosses the River Tees. Bob and Rolf were actually recording the remains of several wooden Roman bridge structures there when they also began recovering archaeological artifacts. It's not altogether surprising that some Roman objects might be found in the River Tees at Piercebridge. With its 3rd century Roman fort and associated vicus or small town, the site is well known for its Roman archaeology, having been the subject of both excavation and field survey throughout the 20th century. The initial interpretation of the assemblage in the 1980s was that it represented rubbish deposited in the river or washed out from a military bathhouse drain. However, the location of the objects in the river would seem to preclude this as an interpretation. The finds were clustered downstream of the remains of a wooden bridge. On this plan, you can see a red blob marking the main concentration of the finds in the middle of the river. And this would suggest that for whatever reason, the finds were thrown from this bridge and settled into the calm waters there. So what did the divers find? Over the course of 30 years, they recovered more than 2,200 objects, 1,444 coins, 40 kilos of pottery, and 15 kilos of animal bone. What was really important when looking at this assemblage was to record all of the objects rather than attaching significance to particular artifact types like coinage or gold jewellery. With the help of a range of specialists, I recorded all these objects and coins in the assemblage on the Portable Antiquities Scheme database, while providing interpretive overviews of each artifact type in our monograph. Following initial cataloguing, it was then a question of exploring its chronology and function. It wasn't possible to date absolutely everything in the assemblage, but as you can see, the majority of objects were Roman in date, including the samples of animal bone, which we had C14 dated. There is, of course, some material from other periods. This includes an Iron Age mirror handle, some early medieval brooches, medieval buckles, and relatively modern molting floor tiles. While it's possible that some of these things may have been deliberately deposited in the river, it does suggest that rubbish is also present, if only in very small quantities. What's immediately apparent when reviewing the Roman materials is that the assemblage is exceptionally rich, with almost every type of Roman artifact you can think of, from items of jewellery through to medical equipment, from wine strainers and beer tankards to military equipment and coins. While the Romans were notorious for leaving lots of rubbish behind, this is more than just what one might expect from an urban rubbish dump. The quality of preservation of the objects is also high, with many objects still being complete. For example, brooches still have their pins and fingerings their intaglios. It's also really important to contextualize the riverine assemblage by comparing it with material recovered from the excavations of the adjacent small town and fort, as well as other Roman sites throughout the region. And these two graphs illustrate some of those comparisons. The first shows the contrast in the chronological distribution of Roman coinage in the river compared with that found during the excavations at Piercebridge. The divergence between the two chronological profiles suggests that the assemblage does not represent riverine erosion of settlement deposits or rubbish. The second, a correspondence analysis plot, immediately indicates the difference in the composition of the riverine and excavation assemblages at Piercebridge and its unique nature in a northern Roman context. So the range of the material, its date and its preservation all tend to suggest that these objects were deliberately deposited in the river, but can we tease out the motivations behind this deposition? There is a small but significant assemblage of objects with religious resonances associated with some of the major gods in the Roman pantheon. These include things like a pipe clay figurine of the god Mercury and two copper alloy figurines of his attributes, the goat, symbolizing fertility, and the tortoise, referring to his invention of the lyre from a tortoise shell. There are also a series of objects associated with the god Mars. These include a silver fingering with a dedicatory inscription to the god Mars, as well as a pierced ceremonial iron spear and a small copper alloy miniaturized version. Now, these objects suggest interaction with a deity particularly popular with the Roman army. Despite the presence of some objects which can be classified as being religious in nature, the majority of the assemblage represents objects with personal resonances. And these can help us explore the identities of people living, working, or passing through Piercebridge in the Roman period. There are hundreds of objects associated with a military sword belt and scabbard, including belt plates from military sword belts and scabbard slides. There are also a huge quantity of harness fittings. While these objects are small enough to be accidental losses rather than individual votive offerings, the huge numbers in which they're found is striking. For example, more items of horse harness have been found in the River Tees at Piercebridge than in all the Roman cavalry forts on Hadrian's Wall put together. Couple with this the observation that no comparable items of military dress or equine equipment have been found during the excavations at Piercebridge, and we can surmise that there is a deliberate element to deposition here. Interestingly, there are also substantial quantities of objects associated with women and children. These include copper alloy and bone hairpins, as well as numerous items of gold jewelry, including necklaces and earrings. While fingerings were also worn by men, analysis of their sizes suggests that the majority of fingerings recovered from the river fall within a range usually associated with women and children. These women were likely wives, tradeswomen, and female slaves associated with the military community, some of whom were undoubtedly from the upper echelons of society. So in summary, our methodology involved examining the entire assemblage, looking at its composition and context, while comparing it with material from the excavations at Piercebridge and the wider region. While concluding that there is likely a significant ritual element to deposition in the river, perhaps related to its location as a stage on the way to the northern frontier, we also attempted to move beyond the binary opposition between ritual and rubbish to think about Roman identities too. While attempting to contextualize the Piercebridge assemblage, Hella and I realized that although unparalleled in size, there were records of other Romano-British riverine assemblages. And now our current project aims to quantify and explore these to better understand the phenomenon throughout the province. So as part of this project, we're currently trawling through excavation reports and historic environment record data to create a database of finds. Although it's in its early stages, thanks to the sterling efforts of our postdoc Carolina de Lima, we've already come across more than 350 riverine sites with Roman finds. Some, like the head of Hadrian from the Thames and the Wensum helmet, are well known as objects, but their riverine context has not been investigated in any detail. While others, like a huge assemblage of material from Lincoln's riverside, remain completely unpublished. When we've completed our data collection, it will be possible to identify geographical distribution patterns by finds type and explore relationships with settlements and river crossings, the size of the river, and lots more besides. And even at this early stage, some very interesting spatial distribution patterns are appearing. And these seem to focus on deposition in the southwest, in particularly places like Hampshire and in northern Britain. As well as producing an overview of riverine votive deposition in Roman Britain, we'll also produce 10 detailed case studies, which will highlight some of the complexities of working with Roman riverine assemblages. These will focus on contextualizing spectacular finds, investigating the impact of metal detecting and mudlarking, and on profiling particular artifacts, sites or rivers, objects or objects. And even while we're in the early stages of this project, we've already identified some contenders to work on. The first of which I'll focus on here is the River Witham in Lincolnshire. Here in the 18th century, the famous naturalist Sir Joseph Banks collected finds dredged from the River Witham near his country estate. And these included Iron Age, Roman and medieval objects. He wrote a manuscript cataloguing these finds, excerpts of which are published in the late 19th century in a Lincolnshire journal. He also corresponded with numerous friends describing his finds, and even undertook some very early experiments in metallurgical analysis. Now, the aim of my case study here will be an attempt to reconstruct his collection of Roman finds using his archive, and to explore the extent to which his antiquarian interest has influenced our understanding of watery deposition in Lincolnshire. The second case study focuses on the assemblage from the River Wear in Verulamium, where in the summer of 1955, Shepherd Freer excavated Site R at a river crossing leading from the Roman theatre to the Folly Lane temple site. Freer published his excavations at the river crossing and even suggested the site may have been a focus for votive deposition. However, his publication omitted discussion of the majority of the finds recovered during the excavation, which he merely refers to as other objects. My aim here is to reconstruct the composition of the entire riverine assemblage using Frere's excavation notebooks and accessioned objects held in the Verulamium Museum collections. I'll then think about how the site fits into the religious landscape at Verulamium and how the assemblage compares with other riverine finds elsewhere in the province. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, this project is a collaboration with colleagues in Germany. And so in the final few minutes, I'll briefly outline the research they're undertaking there. This involves adopting and adapting the methodology we used at Piercebridge to explore a huge assemblage of finds found in the River Moselle in Trier, a late Roman capital and home of the imperial court. In the mid-1970s, when the river levels were particularly low in the Moselle, the people of Trier began to discover Roman objects in their thousands on the riverbed next to the Roman bridge across the river. At the time, the German tabloid press went wild for this and captured a gold rush atmosphere, and the coverage encouraged huge numbers of people to search for artifacts on the riverbed. While some of these objects were donated to the museum, others remained in private ownership. While some of the most impressive or unusual finds donated to the museum have been catalogued, including this figurine depicting Attis and this votive prow, the majority of the material remains unpublished in the museum stores. This includes at least 32,000 coins, 4,000 objects, and many kilos of pottery. The aim of the German team is therefore to catalogue and analyse all this material, while also gaining an overview of the material still retained by collectors in Trier. Over the past 6 months, the German team has begun to record all this material and to get an idea of the composition and character of the assemblage from the Moselle. They're opening up boxes in the museum stores and recording the surprises inside, from stamp tiles to box fittings to key handles. And this has been supplemented by targeted visits from the British team, offering moral support and specialised coinage identification skills. Here you can see me doing some chronological sorting of the 32,000 Roman coins in the assemblage, with each bucket on the floor representing the reign of a Roman emperor. So what are our next steps? Well, over the next 2 years, the German team aimed to create an overview of the Moselle assemblage and assess how to contextualise it, given the relative lack of small finds publication from Roman Trier. They'll also begin interviewing finders and collectors to explore their motivations and the biographies of objects they've collected. Meanwhile, the British team will work on completing a survey of riverine deposition in Britain and use it to explore patterns in the chronology, geography, and composition of assemblages. And finally, we hope to have some lasting impact on the way in which the riverine archaeological resource is approached and treated, particularly given the surge in popularity of underwater metal detecting, mudlarking, and magnet fishing. We hope to develop policy guidance for the reporting, recording, and initial conservation of archaeological objects from non-tidal riverine contexts in England and Wales. And we've started working with a range of stakeholders to make this happen. Thanks very much. And finally, I should say it was a team effort, this presentation. Although I'm here today, I should also mention my colleagues at the University of Cologne, University of Reading, and the University of Trier, who've all been working very hard on the project.
Thank you very, very much. Can you hear me? Oh, have I turned it off? I have a green light at the bottom. Yes? Ah, there we are. Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. That was really, really good. Right, I'd like to open up the floor for questions. So if anyone would want a few minutes for 5 minutes. Questions? Ah, lovely. I'm going to bring the microphone up to you so people can hear. Or we'll see how that goes. Otherwise, I'll repeat the question. Sites that they run the building or things like that, or just
so in terms of our data trawl, we're working with all the historic environment records. So we've contacted all the HER officers to find out about published and unpublished data from riverine contexts. And Carolina's created buffer zones of 50 meters from the rivers, along the rivers, to collect any objects of Roman date from those places. We've also looked through published archaeological reports to find there are any objects recorded from riverine sites or adjacent to rivers. Sometimes it's very difficult to work out what was actually found in a river or on a riverbank next to a river in these reports, but we're working with that. We're also working with the Portable Antiquities Scheme, who may have recorded objects from riverine contexts, and generally contacting archaeological societies, groups, anybody working on archaeology of Roman sites adjacent to rivers. For example, in just outside York, we're working with two archaeologists who've recorded lots of objects from Eckardt and Melbeese with the local community, which appears to be a transshipment site for York. And they've been doing test pitting as part of a community project for a long time, but haven't really been able to contextualize their findings in a wider, make a wider context. So we're helping out in lots of different ways.
Very important. But you find with many Romans, there's almost default position that pre-literate peoples, for example, not taken like an image as in peoples were irrational backward, that do that votive deposition, whereas the Romans were rational. The default position is to say, well, that's very interesting. But
Yeah, yes.
thank you.
There's been a definite tendency amongst scholars to be very accepting of the votive ritual explanation for objects in waters and prehistory. And yet, as soon as they're Roman in date, the Romans are very rational. They build lovely, nice, solid bridges. They wouldn't be throwing this stuff away in rivers. even though it's clear that the Romans had a definite religious ritual relationship with water, and when it's in a constructed Roman situation, so at the sacred spring and bath, we're quite happy to accept that these objects are thrown in deliberately. But when it's in a river, in an open space, they can't quite get their head around it. And they'll come up with convoluted arguments as to why these objects represent rubbish, or, you know, the booty from a raid into Gaul, all these sorts of things, when they don't always completely fit. Now, I'm quite happy to suggest that quite a lot of objects in rivers that are Roman in date are rubbish, and because the Romans had so much stuff and they needed to get rid of it. But I don't think we can necessarily use one explanation. And also whether it's possible to distinguish between what's rubbish and what might have a ritual or religious element is quite complicated too. It doesn't necessarily have to be rubbish or ritual. It could be both.
And I think I've got time for very quick questions. Is that all right? Yeah.
Thanks, that's really cool. That's really exciting how much material you've got to work with. So I'm curious from looking at the work you had in this bridge, you mentioned that you had more calories happening than you did.
Mm-hmm.
What's the survivability between stuff that is in freshwater riverine environments and these sorts of freshwater? Is that, how big a factor do you guys think that is? Like, and is that going to vary how significant, how much stuff you're going to get coming out of the river?
There are clearly survival things to consider, including the survival of objects on land as opposed to water. We have, for example, a much better survival of bone objects in the river, but much fewer numbers than we do at Pierce Bridge from the river than from the archaeological excavations. And when you have to think about things like the river, if you throw something in a river and it's made out of bone, it's going to float away very easily. And some of the lead objects, we have lots of lead ceilings from the river, which have survived because of the anaerobic context. But just the sheer number of bout fittings and equine equipment from the river is really striking, but also the fact that there are just none of comparable types from the excavation of both the settlement and the fort. And that it's those things together, both the quantity and the rarity of the objects seems to suggest some form of deliberate deposition. But of course, riverine context is going to help preserve them if they end up there in the first place.